Welcome back to Q-Dads. I'm Steve, and the final episode of Constellation has dropped. And of course, we'll be touching on all the key details, plus the unanswered questions, including the final, very questionable scene. Before we dive deep into the detail, we just want to thank everyone who's been following us on this cosmic ride. Me and Ben have loved reading all your comments and theories about the show, and really appreciate the support. And of course, we'll be covering more sci-fi shows like this in the future, including the upcoming Dark Matter, so make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. So, grab your cup of tea, sit back and look to the stars as we break down the final of Constellation. The final episode starts with a brief moment today. Jo in the ISS, before then showing us two scenes. The first being Jo moved to this hospital with several nuns around her and the flash of Valia. She is then strapped down and given some kind of electrotherapy. Is this an attempt to calm her mind or change it? A technique like this hasn't been used for quite some time. And we get Bud, now in Henry's body, destroying the Cal. Does his actions mean that he stopped realities mixing in the future? Alice explains everything to Magnus and tries to convince him that this is real. We then get an ultrasound for Jo, which later on is confirmed she is pregnant. But here, the ultrasound looks a lot like the Cal data, with an image splitting in two. Now, Ben did say to me, is this the observer effect for Irina? Or is this the actual image? And she is in fact not pregnant, but now lives with the side effects of long exposure to the Cal data core. I did go back and watch this scene a few times, to see if we got a hint that the other nurses saw something. But all they say is that the image is corrupt. Not only that, but later Irina says Jo is 4 weeks pregnant. Now, this is very early for an ultrasound to pick up a fetus, and even if they did, it would have to be an internal one. So, is this just to produce a screw up? Or is Irina lying and she was looking for something else? I did also check the date of when Jo returned to Earth. Based on the opening scenes of episode 1, where she's at the cabin, and the events on the ISS, 5 weeks are supposed to have passed. Plus, there had been a few days potentially between the cabin and now, so it's plausible she could be pregnant. My only doubts on this are her and Magnus in the blue reality were having issues and Jo was having an affair. Could Jo now essentially be the Cal? Could her baby be the thing connecting the worlds? As it's clear by the end of the episode that the realities are still entwined. Henry is taken by the police for the murder of Ian Roberts and the attempted murder of Paul. Here we confirm that the date Paul was shot was actually the 8th of November 2021. Now, this throws wide open the dates in these realities. I've looked and looked, and it's very rare the producers let dates slip. So, why do I think this is big? As mentioned previously, the events in episode 1 and the cabin are 5 weeks apart. Now, we have a date from episode 1 on the ISS, when Red Jo in the blue reality is attempting to get the batteries, and that date is the 14th of October 2021. So, looking at these two dates, we either have a continuity error or one reality is not moving at the same time as the other. We then skip over to Bud, who doesn't care about the broken Cal, making the decision that he is going to make this life his again. But I do want to point out here, not only was he in his pants, but who eats cheesecake with their hands? Use a fork, Bud. We also get another scene that made me chuckle, when Alice tells Magnus his pancakes taste like dirt, shall we say.
It tastes like shit.
It does not taste like shit. You've never tasted shit.
The series has been great, and actually we sometimes overlook the subtle bits of comedy throughout, so I just wanted to mention that, as it does add to the show. Not only that, the acting has been on point too. I really enjoyed seeing how the two Magnuses deal with their respective Alices. It's been great writing. Jo wakes up but is trapped in her room, but Irina tries to convince her to take the pills, especially with her being pregnant. And she figures Irene and Valia are the same. Also, in the scenes leading up to this, a piano and photos are dropped in. Irina later says that doing things that this world/body recognises will help. It's at this point I started to speculate. Could you essentially gain the memories of the reality by doing this? As clearly, Jo can play the piano here. Now, although I mentioned there's a chance Jo is not pregnant, they do actually offer different coloured pills. Does this mean Irina is actually telling her the truth when they give her pills without lithium? Henry has a lie detector and DNA test to show he's not the same person as Bud, but this doesn't go well and he's charged with the crimes Bud committed. I do question how his story will go now, but more on that in a moment. More importantly though, and a question that is going to be left open for a while, why did Henry think his DNA would be twisted differently? And my only answer here is that the two realities are not carbon copies of each other. I mean, even Alice's room was a mirror image. So Henry must have run tests on himself when he first swapped with Bud and noticed the difference in DNA. Now it seems to me only the minds of people swap and not their actual bodies. So why did Henry think his DNA would be different? Was his DNA different when he first got to the blue reality? Ilias gives Joe a set of keys to escape, but Joe decides to stay after seeing two old crazy people, which Irina later confirms to be only one person, the first person in space. But clearly Joe is still seeing two realities. I also question, how much does Ilias know? And has he experienced anything like this? We then see both versions of Magnus talk to a therapist about their lives, as well as both Alice's simultaneously loving theirs and talking to their friends. I really enjoyed this as it seemed to nicely tie up both realities, as both Alice's seem to have come to terms with their lives that they now have to live. Red Alice actually moves home and chooses to ignore and leave Blue Alice behind. Is this because the thought of knowing her mom is alive in another reality is just too much for her? Or is she doing this purely for the people around her? We then get a couple of scenes. Joe and Blue Alice talk about the other versions and both decide they need each other. We then get Irina sending an email about getting others to approach her about similar feelings of madness. Is this based from her earlier meeting with Bud and now she needs to rally the troops, so to speak? And Paul also wakes in hospital, shocked and disorientated. Now, this for me was a big moment. Ben and I were discussing this and we both have a theory. Ben was saying that the reason Paul said he had seen things was like how Alice saw Valia while unconscious. Ben thinks Paul might have spoken to the other Joe or something else. I, on the other hand, think this is now Red Paul. I think somehow Paul nearly dying allowed them to change back. And you might question how, seeing as Red Paul was dead. Well, we've seen from Valia that clearly the ties between life and death are not clear cut. Even Alice makes a joke, saying half dead, half alive. So yeah, I think this is Red Paul returning to his original body. Let me know what you think. Then we get on to the last couple of seconds of the episode, and the biggest cliffhanger ever, with a scene of Joe on the ISS, with half a head, yet at the last moment we see her eye move, and then she grabs the iPad. Firstly, what the hell? Secondly, is this a trick in the mind? Or is Joe in the red reality actually still alive somehow? As we did see Paul ditch her body. I somehow can't see this being a real scene though. I imagine this to be like the Valia is for Alice, where although she's dead, she still appears in a dream, as Alice's friend did mention she sometimes sees Paul in her dreams, meaning this could be a similar version of that. Some could argue that this is the third reality, where a different accident happened, as the wound does look slightly different, with Joe banging her head almost front facing, yet the scarring on this Joe looked more in the side of her head. And also her eye was missing, which I don't think we saw originally. Is she the Joe that unlocked the bolt in the ISS? Or is it just a dream version? And let's touch on the iPad for a second. So if this Joe is supposed to be Blue Joe, then we would say she's in Red Joe's world. So why is the iPad the same as the one in Blue Joe's world? We see in the first episode the iPads swap back and forth, but this screensaver is clearly a picture of Blue Alice. Now, I went back to episode 1, and around the 38-minute mark, we see the screensaver on the iPad Joe is using. In episode 2, around the 28-minute mark, Red Joe in the blue reality leaves that iPad on the ISS. So this leads me to ask, has Blue Joe now crossed back to her reality? Or has somehow the iPad swapped realities? If it's the latter, this would be the first time an object has swapped. I think either way, even though the Cal's been destroyed, we have more entanglement going on. And one final thing to note, is Blue Joe waking actually a past event? As if she's the one to push the button on the ISS, then she must have been awake at the point the iPad is pushed in. Just to add to that too, the part where Paul locked Joe's body is on the same side as where Red Joe pushes the iPad to, as the worlds are mirror imaged. Also, as I was recording this, I remembered having two versions of a person in the same world for a period of time is possible, as dead Irina hits the ISS while the living Irina is down on Earth. Is that the answer? Is it because, as one of our commenters mentioned, Joe is unable to be observed in space? Finally, if Joe is pregnant on Earth with what looks like some form of entanglement, will the Joe in space also become pregnant? As Alice did say, which reality is this baby going to be from? Throughout this episode, we get a lot of scenes with Bud and Henry. Now, Bud seems to be on this path of correcting his life, or at least putting his stamp back on it. He isn't afraid to confront Irina about her death in the other reality, and happily confronts Ian Roberts later in some kind of showboating way, as he knows he got away with murder. Will he now go to see his family, as this was something he didn't get to do in the previous reality? And Henry is now being charged with murder. Will he be able to convince this world that he is in fact in the wrong body? Or will he suffer in Bud's body until someone reverses it? It was interesting to see that it seems to be minds that switch, as their DNA is exactly the same. Just a little note here, and it might not be anything, but when Bud visits Ian Roberts, Ian is telling the story of the double event. Now I know this is a real thing, but to choose that name of any event they could have ever looked at, is this a nod to all the things happening now? Also, I want to touch on Valia. Irene mentions to Alice that her friends call her Valia, which I think means Irina knew Valia had spoken to Alice due to their minds being entangled. And is this Irina's way of telling Alice she can trust Valia to help her find her mom? Maybe a season 2 plot. Finally, as the series ends, we still have the biggest question. Why does space cause an entanglement? As we are shown that the Cal is able to almost lock both realities together. However, Irina's events predate the Cal, and it's clear the man who was the first man in space predates it too. It feels almost weird that the Cal has anything to do with the events. And as I mentioned earlier, I think Joe's baby is taking on the properties of the Cal. Does the Cal merely focus the realities when it's close by? I really don't know, and I would love to hear your theories on this. Now, before I ask you some questions, I was about to say, for the last time this series, but actually, myself and Ben will be doing a final video where we look at the unanswered questions and try to theorise or at least document them in video form ready for season 2. So let us know in the comments any outstanding questions you have that you would like to see in that video. Overall, this series has been incredible and we've had so many theories from start to finish, but as mentioned, there are so many questions left unanswered. Like, who helped in the ISS? Is Joe actually pregnant? And is there a third reality or not? But also, what doors have now been swung wide open, ready for season 2? Are we going to see our Alices reunite? Or Joe swap realities? Will the truth come out about Irina, Bud or Henry? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, as you don't want to miss our upcoming breakdowns. And, as always, I'll catch you next time with something new.